Here at 112BK, people say to us all the time, please, enough with the segments about the members of Van Halen, not to mention David Lee Roth's member. Can we get more stories about city agencies? We've heard you loud and clear, and our next guests are here to talk about a legit dramatic fight over landmarking in Greenwich Village. Landmarking is often seen as a way of protecting important buildings, but who gets to decide what's worth preserving and what's not? And what happens when the owner of the building doesn't want it to be landmarked? That's the current state of affairs over at the Strand, the much-loved bookstore that happens to be housed in a very beautiful historic building. To tell us more, we're joined by Simeon Bankoff, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. Welcome back to Brick House.
Thanks.
And Andrew Berman, Executive Director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Andrew, maybe you can tell us a little bit about this current issue, about how there are 7 buildings that are set to be landmarked.
Sure. Yeah, so the city has picked 7 buildings on Broadway, south of Union Square, to consider for landmark designation. They've been heard by the Landmarks Preservation Commission already in a public hearing, and there's going to be another hearing specifically on the building housing the Strand coming up. The Strand is the only one that's opposing designation, and there's a lot of different sides to this story. One is from our perspective that we really wish the city would actually be looking much more broadly than these 7 buildings. That whole area is under a tremendous amount of pressure. We're having a lot of historic buildings torn down and replaced by office towers and hotels and condo high-rises. The Strand has definitely been pushing back on that, saying that landmarking would harm their business. But certainly from our experience, businesses tend to thrive in historic districts and landmark districts. And while certainly there's a layer of bureaucracy there, and nobody loves bureaucracy, it's usually pretty navigable. And I think the benefits far outweigh the costs.
And Simeon, do you agree? Do you think that these buildings should be landmarked?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I also agree with Andrew that the city is not doing enough in the area, that whole stretch of Lower Broadway is a very interesting cultural history involving the labor movement, involving manufacturing history that people don't really know about, and the buildings are still there. So in addition to being aesthetically beautiful and historically important, they also have that sort of fission of cultural history that will be forgotten when they're all replaced by enormous gleaming towers. With regard to the Strand itself, the building is is a lovely building by a interesting architect named Berkmeyer, who was an enormous enthusiast for steel construction and skyscraper development, actually. He was active in New York, but the only other landmark building that he had done is a church up in East Tremont in the Bronx, as I recall.
And how were these 7 buildings selected, Andrew?
So the mayor pushed through recently this plan to get a rezoning on 14th Street, just a block or so away from this building, for something called a tech hub, this very large development that's probably going to spur even more of this sort of office building development in this area south of Union Square, where the Strand building is. My organization, HDC, and many others in the community said, look, if you want to put the tech hub on 14th Street, we can live with that on 14th Street, but we want the neighborhood to the south to be protected and not overwhelmed by a wave of tech-related development that would come along with it. And so we put forward proposals to protect the neighborhood either through landmarking or zoning or both. We identified close to 200 buildings in the neighborhood that we thought were worthy of landmark or historic district protection.
200?
200,
But we're
yes.
talking about 7, so how did we...
So the city cherry-picked 7 buildings out of those 200. We didn't pick them. We didn't even know which 7 they were until they were publicly announced. And somewhat ironically, they picked the 7 buildings that were least endangered and probably not likely to be endangered anytime soon. That doesn't make them any less worthy of designation, but they're certainly not the place where we think they should be starting this process. So even as preservationists, we have a beef with the way that the city has gone about this.
I see. So you think that it's misplaced priorities and that they went for kind of low-hanging fruit?
Very true.
Our offices are actually in that general area. You can't walk down a block in that particular neighborhood without seeing enormous amounts of construction, be it buildings being torn down, new buildings being built up. Right across from Webster Hall, for example, we joined Greenwich Village Society in protesting the demolition of 3 affordable housing tenements, which were being demolished for a Moxie hotel that is specifically being targeted at young, affluent travelers.
And
So-
tenements are so passé.
Right.
Nobody wants to stay there.
No one wants to stay
So
there.
I think that this gets at the heart of things a little bit, which is that historic designation often refers to the edifice of the building itself instead of what happened inside the building. And that we're seeing that these 7 buildings are sort of beautiful, very expensive, aesthetically pleasing pieces of architecture, whereas perhaps these tenements, because they are less beautiful, are not being protected. Would you say that's true, Andrew?
It's true that landmark designation, for better and worse, really only applies to kind of the aesthetics of the building. That doesn't mean that nothing ever gets to change. So certainly we would be the last people to say that the way to protect or preserve small businesses is through landmarking, although it can sometimes be somewhat helpful in a more indirect kind of way. But the flip side is the landmarking certainly does not harm small businesses. The Landmarks Preservation Commission is very conscious of the fact that buildings are living, breathing entities with businesses inside of them or residences that need to grow and change. And so certainly we believe that the Strand would continue to be able to thrive under landmark designation. All of that said, we would prefer that the city took a different approach, step back, look more broadly at this neighborhood, and prioritize those buildings that were most endangered.
The Landmarks Preservation Commission only has the power to regulate architecture. That is, they can't regulate use. That's not within their abilities. But they have tried very successfully, by their own rights, for many years to make it as easy as possible for businesses and residents and applicants to get through the permitting process. We just had a big multi-year conversation about streamlining their rules to allow for approvals. And in fact, in the latest Mayor's Management Report, the stuff that happens on the inside that the Landmarks Commission doesn't really consider anyway, is generally permitted within less than 1 business day, given all the if the applicant has all of their forms correctly. So for the Strand to say, oh my goodness, this is the worst thing ever, this is going to knock us out of business because this is so much paperwork and will take so long and will be so onerous, doesn't really make a lot of sense. One of the concerns, for example, that we've heard voiced is that the Strand wishes to create a cafe. Now, the fact of the matter is, getting the health department in to give them all the food handling licenses and sign off on all of that stuff is a lot more onerous than getting the Landmarks Preservation Commission to allow for a sign that says cafe this way.
So, sticking with you, Simeon, what is the owner, Nancy Bass-Wyden's, objection then if this landmarking would only apply to the exterior of the building and not the changes on the inside? What is her beef with it?
I cannot see into her heart. So,
Andrew, can you see into her heart? Do you know?
I mean, I think Nancy, who I know very well and who, I admire in terms of, what she's done with an iconic New York City business, is really the best person to kind of defend that. But I think we would both agree from our experience working for years with property owners and businesses located in landmark districts that, again, it is an additional layer of bureaucracy. Nobody loves to have another person that you have to go to sort of file a paper with, but it is not at all very onerous at all.
Nancy Bass-Wyden is also married to a senator.
Right, from Oregon.
Right, from Oregon. Because of that, we also have access to their tax returns. So we know that in 2014, there were reported earnings of $1 million from the bookstore. And I know that a lot of Nancy Bass-Wyden's concerns about this are, that the Strand is barely holding on as a small business. And one of our reporters interviewed her, and she said that, she might have to look at trimming staff if this went through because the Strand was not making money. So this seems to be a situation where she is in conflict with the other the other building owners who do want to see this landmark designation passed.
This is her contention that this is going to cost her more money. There's actually no provable, demonstrable way that she can say this is going to cost more money.
But I guess also I wonder if this is an argument in addition for the building to be landmarked, if we need something like how San Francisco has
The
a legacy.
business? Oh, yes, we do.
Sure. And we and other preservationists and other concerned New Yorkers have been working on that. Actually, we've been a forceful advocate of something called the Small Business Job Survival Act. We've been looking at trying to promote legislation in New York City that would allow neighborhoods who want it to limit the proliferation of chain stores so that they don't have that kind of unfair competition from the big corporate giants.
I'm curious about how much landmarking a building can do to try and preserve the culture inside, since we don't have like a legacy business preservation
but we should.
yet, which I hope we do.
Right.
For example, like the Stonewall Inn.
Right. So
There's nothing that would prevent like Guy Fieri from opening a restaurant inside, but what would he be prevented from
But half
doing?
the Stonewall Inn at the moment is still the a nail salon.
Yeah. It's a perfect example, though, and it's one we actually spearheaded the drive to get the Stonewall landmarked, and we worked with advocates on a kind of parallel track, which is that, okay, we want to save the building because obviously there's no way that the Stonewall is going to stay there if the building is demolished. And by the way, keep in mind there was no Stonewall for about 20 years. This is actually a new Stonewall that took took over the space historically where a Stonewall bar had been located. But we've been working with advocates to try to come up with a way to ensure that something like the Stonewall stays there in perpetuity, because you're right, if it becomes a Starbucks or a bagel shop or a Duane Reade, you've still lost something incredibly important. So we need to be looking at all of those things. Currently, we have landmarking, which is this mechanism, rarely used, again, about 3% of New York, to protect a building. We don't have similar mechanisms to protect businesses or other kinds of institutions. We and many others are working to try to make that or something like that happen as well. Both are needed. The answer is to do more, not to do less.
And this is sort of the holistic approach that you've been advocating for.
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this one is a little bit in the weeds, but going back to the Strand building, there's something about the air rights or how tall the building.
The building is currently overbuilt as under its current zoning, which means that were the building to be demolished, the as of right building that could be built, in its stead would be smaller. Now, keep in mind, however, that's only under its current zoning. Zoning changes. Zoning changes all the time. And there's nothing to say that in 20 years from now, the zoning might not change because the tech hub has been so spectacularly successful that we're building 40-story buildings around there, all with heliports or teleporters or whatever they choose to put in there. And then it could potentially be a development site. That happened in East Midtown, actually. When you see 270 Park Avenue, the Chase building, which is 55 stories, they're demolishing it because they got upzoned and they can now build it up to 70 stories.
Wow.
So they're going to it's going to be the largest planned demolition of a building in human history, in order to gain another 15 stories.
Is there an example of a neighborhood or perhaps another city even that has really gotten its landmarking right and in doing so has managed to preserve the heritage and the feeling of a neighborhood from tech hubs coming in or what have you?
I think we are striking that balance here in New York. I think we need to do a lot more to help support small businesses and other kinds of institutions that make the city special in the way that it is. But, New York is undergoing a tremendous building boom at the moment, but we also have the most robust landmark program of any city in the country. So we're actually kind of tops in both respects, and I think that's something we can be very proud of.
If you look back in the 1980s, the Broadway theaters were dark. There was a distinct possibility, and in fact plans to redevelop Times Square and that area and get rid of most of the theaters. They were dark. They were these big old white elephants that were leaky and just costing money to keep, and no one wanted them. And in fact, the Broadway theater owners, there were 3 of them at the time, were attempting to demolish some of them, and we lost 2. There was a pushback. There was, and the Landmarks Commission and the city came in and said that theater is an incredibly important part of New York City, and these need to be landmarked, and we need to do everything we can do to try to get more theater in New York. And there were lawsuits and back and forth, but at the end of the day, more than a dozen theater, I think it was 16 theaters, were actually designated as landmarks. So they were like, all right, we're going to keep these buildings. And now, 25 years later, 30 years later, Broadway is a multi-billion-dollar business.
Right. Attracting a huge number of tourists, generating lots of income, adding incredibly to the cultural vitality of New York. So there are definitely ways of doing this, and preservation is an incredibly important piece of that.
Great. Well, Simeon, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.